3 days before her wedding, a friend whispered a name Evelyn had never heard before, and suddenly the man she loved looked like a stranger. Rain hammered the barn roof as Luke Mercer stood motionless beside a lantern, his face half hidden in shadow. A loose chain clinked against a stall door. Mud dripped from Evelyn's coat onto the wooden floor. Neither of them moved. Neither looked away. Then Luke finally spoke 4 words that made her stomach drop. Outside, thunder rolled across the Wyoming valley, and Evelyn realized she might be standing in front of a man whose real reason for marrying her had never been spoken aloud. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and whether you would have asked the question Evelyn was about to ask. 3 days before her wedding, Evelyn Carter sat in a narrow room behind the church and stitched the loose edge of her wedding dress by hand. The room was small. A single window faced Main Street. A black iron stove sat cold in the corner because the afternoon sun had warmed the building enough. Dust floated through the light. Somewhere outside, a wagon rolled over the hard-packed road, its wheels rattling against loose stones. Evelyn bent closer to the fabric. The dress wasn't fancy. It was cream-colored cotton with a modest collar and sleeves she had sewn herself during the winter evenings. There were no pearls, no lace imported from the East, just neat stitches and careful work. It suited her. She had almost finished repairing the hem when the door opened without a knock. Mabel Turner stepped inside. One look at her face made Evelyn stop sewing. Mabel was rarely quiet. Today she looked as if she had carried something heavy all the way across town. "You got a minute?" Mabel asked. Evelyn set the needle down. "Of course." Mabel closed the door from behind her. For several seconds, she simply stood there, twisting her gloves together. That alone was enough to make Evelyn uneasy. "What happened?" Mabel swallowed. "I heard something last night." The room seemed to grow smaller. Evelyn waited. The church bell outside marked the hour. Then Mabel spoke. "Luke Mercer is Benjamin Mercer's brother." The words landed hard. Evelyn stared at her. Everyone in Dry Creek knew the Mercer name. Not because of Luke, because of Benjamin. Years ago, Benjamin Mercer had lost everything after taking a loan from Harold Carter's bank. Land, cattle, his future. The story had never completely disappeared from town gossip. It simply slept beneath newer stories. Evelyn slowly stood. "You're sure?" Mabel nodded. "I heard it from Judge Reed's clerk. He found old records while sorting documents." The room fell silent. Outside, a horse snorted near the hitching post. Evelyn looked toward the window. For years she had known Luke Mercer. Not closely. Not the way a wife should know a husband. But enough. Enough to trust him. Or so she had thought. "Why didn't he tell me?" she asked quietly. Mabel looked away. "Maybe because he didn't want you asking questions." Evelyn felt something cold settle inside her chest. Mabel stepped closer. "Franny," she stopped herself. Old habit, then corrected. "Evelyn, listen to me." Evelyn didn't answer. Mabel's voice lowered. "People still talk about what happened to Benjamin." The church seemed unusually still. Even the birds outside had gone quiet. Then Mabel said the thing Evelyn would remember all night. The thing she would hear every time she closed her eyes. "What if he's marrying you to take back what his family lost?" The words hung in the room, heavy, unmoving. Evelyn looked down at the unfinished dress in her hands. 3 days. Only 3 days remained before she would stand beside Luke Mercer and promise him the rest of her life. 3 days. And suddenly she realized there were things she didn't know. Important things. Dangerous things. Mabel touched her arm gently. I'm not saying it's true. But what if it is? Neither woman spoke for a long moment. Finally, Mabel gathered her gloves. I just thought you deserved to know. After she left, Evelyn remained alone beside the window. The afternoon sun had begun sliding lower toward the western hills. Shadows stretched across Dry Creek. The town looked exactly as it always had. The mercantile, the barber shop, the hotel with its faded sign. Nothing appeared different, yet everything felt different now. She moved closer to the glass. Beyond town, near a weathered farmhouse at the edge of the valley, she spotted a familiar figure. Luke. He stood beside a broken fence belonging to Mrs. Whitaker, an elderly widow who lived alone. His horse waited nearby. His sleeves were rolled to his forearms. A hammer hung from one hand. He worked slowly, carefully, replacing damaged boards one at a time. Mrs. Whitaker sat on her porch watching. At one point, Luke removed his hat and listened while the old woman spoke. He didn't interrupt, didn't rush her, just listened. The same way he always listened. The same way he had listened to Evelyn every time she spoke. The sight should have comforted her. Instead, it made her stomach tighten. Because if Mabel was right, then every kindness suddenly carried another question behind it. Had he planned this all along? Had every quiet conversation been part of something larger? The distance between the church and the widow's farm was too great to hear voices. All Evelyn could see was Luke lifting another board into place. Calm, steady, patient. A man completely at ease, and somehow that troubled her more than anger ever could. The most frightening thing about Luke Mercer was not that he looked capable of revenge. It was that he looked incapable of it. The sun dropped lower. Luke finished the repair and shook Mrs. Whitaker's hand before climbing onto his horse. For a brief moment, he turned toward town, toward the church, toward the window where Evelyn stood. She couldn't tell if he saw her, but she stepped back anyway. Her pulse quickened. 3 days before the wedding. 3 days before she promised him everything. And for the first time since accepting his proposal, Evelyn Carter found herself wondering whether she truly knew the man she was about to marry, or whether the biggest secret in Dry Creek had been standing beside her all along. That night, she slept very little. The wind moved softly against the church walls. Somewhere beyond town, a coyote called from the distant hills. The sound drifted through the darkness and faded. Evelyn lay awake listening. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Luke standing beside Mrs. Whitaker's fence. Calm, patient, impossible to read. By dawn, she had made a decision. If there was a truth hiding in Dry Creek, she would find it herself. The next morning arrived cold and bright. Frost clung to the grass along Main Street. Smoke rose from chimneys across town. Evelyn left the church after breakfast carrying a small leather satchel and headed toward the courthouse. Judge Samuel Reed no longer handled many cases. Age had slowed him, but he still occupied the same office beside the county records room. The old building smelled of dust, paper, and lamp oil. When she arrived, the judge sat behind his desk wearing reading spectacles low on his nose. He looked up. Evelyn, she smiled politely. Judge Reed. His eyes narrowed slightly. 3 days before your wedding, and you're visiting an old man instead of planning a celebration? Evelyn tried to smile. It didn't quite work. The judge noticed. Good judges usually noticed things. After a moment, he leaned back. What are you looking for? The question hung between them. Evelyn glanced toward the records room. Benjamin Mercer. The judge removed his spectacles. For a long second, neither spoke. Outside, wagon wheels rolled past the courthouse. Finally, he nodded. I wondered when someone would ask. An hour later, Evelyn sat alone at a wooden table beneath a narrow window. Old ledgers rested in front of her. Loan records, property transfers, mortgage agreements. The pages crackled softly each time she turned them. Then she found it. Benjamin Mercer. The signature looked steady, confident. A man building a future. Evelyn kept reading. The further she went, the colder she felt. The interest rate was high, far higher than most ranchers could reasonably manage. The repayment period was short, and near the bottom sat a clause that made her stomach tighten. The bank reserved the right to demand full repayment under certain conditions, a condition broad enough to be used almost any time. She read the page twice, then a third time. The room suddenly felt smaller. Outside the window, she watched a pair of children run past, carrying school books. For years, she had defended her father whenever people criticized him. Now she wasn't so certain. The papers didn't tell the whole story, but they told enough. Benjamin Mercer had never been given much room to succeed. By noon, she stepped back onto Main Street. The sunlight felt harsh. The world looked unchanged. Yet something inside her had shifted. She found herself walking without direction. Past the feed store, past the barber, past the livery stable. Then she spotted Luke. He was standing outside the Dawson Ranch on the edge of town. An elderly rancher named Eli Dawson sat nearby on an overturned barrel. One side of the horse barn had partially collapsed during winter storms. Luke was repairing it. Not quickly, not carelessly, steadily. He listened while the old man talked. Then he climbed a ladder and replaced damaged boards one at a time. No payment changed hands. No agreement was discussed. Just work, honest work. Evelyn watched from across the road. The picture in front of her didn't match the picture inside the courthouse ledger. Later that afternoon, she saw him again. A young ranch hand led a lame horse into town. Most owners would have sold the animal. A horse that couldn't work was expensive to keep. But Luke examined the injured leg, rubbed the animal's neck, and handed the young man a few folded bills. Then he led the horse away himself. The horse followed willingly, as though it already trusted him. Evelyn stood outside the mercantile holding a small sack of flour and watched until he disappeared down the road. That evening, another piece settled into place. Near sunset, she delivered supplies to the Parker family. Their youngest child had been sick most of winter. The cupboards were nearly empty. When Mrs. Parker opened the door, a wrapped package already sat on the porch. Fresh venison, enough for several meals. No note. No name. Mrs. Parker sighed. That man won't let anyone thank him. Evelyn already knew the answer. Luke? The woman smiled. Who else? The sun was setting behind the mountains by the time Evelyn returned to town. Orange light spilled across the valley. Long shadows stretched over the road. She stopped beside the church gate. For a while, she simply stood there. The courthouse records told one story. The man she saw every day told another. One version said Luke Mercer had every reason to hate her family. The other showed a man who quietly repaired fences, cared for injured animals, and helped struggling neighbors when nobody was looking. Neither version felt false. That was what troubled her most. As darkness settled over Dry Creek, Evelyn realized she had not moved any closer to an answer. Instead, she had found two truths pulling against each other, and somewhere between them stood the man she was about to marry. The man whose past seemed darker than she had known, and whose heart seemed kinder than she could explain. The weather turned 2 days before the wedding. By late afternoon, thick gray clouds rolled over the mountains west of Dry Creek. The wind arrived first, then the cold. Store owners pulled awnings tighter. Ranch hands hurried horses into shelter. Dust swirled through the streets before the first drops of rain struck the ground. Evelyn spent most of the day trying to focus on her work at the church. She failed. Every lesson she taught, every page she turned, every conversation she had. Her thoughts returned to Luke. By sunset, the storm had settled over the valley. Rain drummed against rooftops. The church windows rattled, and something inside Evelyn finally reached its limit. She put on her coat, wrapped a wool scarf around her neck, and stepped into the storm. The road to Cedar Run Ranch was muddy and nearly empty. Lightning flickered beyond the distant hills. By the time she reached the property, her boots were soaked. She found Luke near the largest barn. Lantern light glowed through the open doorway. Inside, horses shifted in their stalls while rain hammered the roof overhead. Luke stood on a ladder securing a loose beam before the wind could tear it free. He climbed down when he saw her. Concern crossed his face. A brief flash, gone almost immediately. "Evelyn, you shouldn't be out in this weather." "Neither should you," she wanted to say. Instead, she stood there gripping her wet gloves. "We need to talk." Luke studied her for a moment, then nodded. The barn grew quiet except for the rain. He hung the hammer on a peg and waited, as if he already knew what was coming. Evelyn took a breath. "I know about Benjamin." The lantern flame shifted in the draft. Luke didn't move. "I know about the loan." Still nothing. She swallowed. "I know what happened to your family." For several seconds, only the storm answered. Then Luke looked toward the open barn door, toward the dark fields beyond. "When I came to Dry Creek," he said quietly, "I was angry." The words landed harder than she expected, not because he raised his voice, because he didn't. Evelyn felt her chest tighten. Luke rested one hand against a fence rail. Rainwater dripped from the brim of his hat. "My brother lost everything." His eyes stayed fixed on the darkness outside. The land, the cattle, the future he'd spent years building. Evelyn said nothing. Luke rarely talked about himself. Now every word seemed difficult. "I spent a long time looking for someone to blame." The horses shifted softly behind them. "I found your father's name on the papers." Evelyn looked down at her gloves. Part of her wished she had never come. Part of her needed to hear every word. Luke continued. "When I arrived here 4 years ago, I told myself I only wanted answers." A pause, then another. The storm seemed to lean closer. Finally, he spoke again. "That wasn't entirely true." Evelyn slowly lifted her eyes. Luke met her gaze. For the first time since she'd known him, there was no wall between them, only honesty. "I thought about making Harold Carter lose what mattered to him." The barn suddenly felt colder. The fear she'd carried for days stood directly in front of her now. Real, undeniable. Luke had come to Dry Creek carrying revenge. Not rumor, not gossip. Truth. Evelyn's throat tightened. "And me?" she asked softly. The question barely rose above the sound of rain. Luke looked away, back toward the black fields beyond the barn. His jaw tightened once. Then he fell silent. Long enough that the answer became its own kind of wound. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley. Inside, neither moved. And for the first time since agreeing to marry Luke Mercer, Evelyn wondered whether the man she loved had ever truly been walking toward her, or whether she had simply been standing in the path of a storm that began long before they met. The rain continued through most of the night. Evelyn barely slept. The conversation in the barn replayed over and over in her mind. "When I came to Dry Creek, I was angry." The words followed her into the morning. By sunrise, the storm had moved east. The clouds were breaking apart above the mountains. Water dripped from rooftops. Mud covered the wagon ruts along Main Street. Evelyn was sweeping the church steps when she heard a horse stop nearby. She didn't need to look up. She knew who it was. Luke removed his hat. For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them felt different now. Not empty, heavy, like something unfinished. "I didn't tell you everything," Luke said. Evelyn rested the broom against the railing. The morning air smelled of wet earth and pine. Luke stepped onto the porch. His boots left damp marks on the wood. Then he sat on the top step. Not beside her. Not too close. Just close enough. The way he always respected space when something mattered. For several moments he watched sunlight appear on the distant hills. Then he began. 4 years ago, Dry Creek got hit by that fever. Evelyn immediately remembered. Everyone in town remembered. The doctor's office had been full. Families had stayed inside. Children had grown sick overnight. Luke folded his hands together. "When I first arrived, I was staying above the feed store." His voice remained low. "I didn't know anyone." He glanced toward the church doors. "One night I saw lantern light in here long after midnight." Evelyn listened quietly. Luke looked away toward the cemetery behind the church. There were people afraid to come near the sick. His jaw tightened slightly. "But every night, you came anyway." A breeze stirred across the porch. For the first time, Evelyn realized he wasn't talking about her father. He wasn't talking about revenge. He was talking about her. Luke continued. "I saw you carrying water buckets from the pump when everyone else was asleep." Evelyn remembered those nights. The endless washing, the medicine, the children crying from fever, the exhaustion. At the time, she had assumed nobody noticed. Luke gave a faint shake of his head. There was a little boy, couldn't have been older than 7. Evelyn knew exactly which child he meant. Thomas Avery, an orphan. Luke stared toward the church window. He was scared. The memory seemed clear in his mind. "You sat beside him until dawn." Evelyn looked down at her hands. The wood grain on the porch blurred slightly. Luke's voice softened. "When the food ran low, you gave him your supper." A long silence followed. The town was slowly waking around them. A wagon crossed Main Street. Somewhere a dog barked. Luke exhaled slowly. That's when things started changing. Evelyn looked at him. Luke met her eyes. For once, he didn't look away. "I came here carrying anger." His voice was steady. "But every time I saw you, it became harder to hold on to." The world seemed unusually quiet. Luke gave a small laugh, almost embarrassed. "I don't remember exactly when I stopped hating your father." He paused. "But I remember exactly when I started loving you." The words weren't dramatic. They weren't polished. They sounded like the truth. Simple. Certain. Evelyn felt something loosen inside her chest. A knot she hadn't realized she was carrying. Luke looked down briefly. "Asking you to marry me was the hardest thing I've ever done." That surprised her. "You've faced blizzards. You've driven cattle through floods." A faint smile touched his face. None of that required courage. The smile disappeared almost immediately. "Asking you did." For a while, neither spoke. The church bell rang in the distance, a new hour beginning. Finally, Evelyn reached out. Only a little. Just enough for her hand to rest over his. Luke didn't move. Neither did she. The gesture felt small, yet somehow it said everything words couldn't. 3 days later, the wedding took place beneath a clear Wyoming sky. The storm was gone. The mountains stood bright and blue beyond the valley. Neighbors gathered beside the church, ranchers in clean coats, children with freshly combed hair. Mrs. Whitaker sat in the front row holding a handkerchief. Luke stood waiting near the preacher. Still. Calm. Just as he always was. But when Evelyn reached him, she noticed something she had never seen before. His hands weren't perfectly steady, only slightly, but enough. And somehow that made her smile. The ceremony was simple. No grand speeches, no lavish decorations, just promises spoken beneath open sky. When it was finished, applause drifted across the churchyard. For the first time in days, peace seemed possible. But before the celebration fully began, an elderly figure approached from the edge of the crowd. Judge Samuel Reed. The old man carried a weathered wooden box beneath one arm. His expression was thoughtful, serious. He stopped in front of Evelyn. I found something while clearing old county records. The judge carefully placed the box into her hands. Dust clung to the corners. The brass latch showed years of wear. I believe your family needs to see what's inside. Luke and Evelyn exchanged a glance. The judge's eyes lingered on the box. Whatever he had discovered, it clearly mattered. And as the celebration continued around them, neither noticed the music, neither noticed the laughter. Because suddenly both of them were staring at that small wooden box and wondering what forgotten truth had survived all these years inside. The celebration continued around them. Children ran between tables. Someone laughed near the church gate. Coffee steamed from enamel pots set beside trays of biscuits. But Evelyn barely heard any of it. She carried the wooden box inside the church, while Luke followed close behind. Judge Reed walked with them. The old man moved slowly now, leaning on his cane as they entered the quiet sanctuary. Sunlight spilled through the windows and stretched across the wooden floor. The judge removed a ring of keys from his pocket. I found this in a storage room behind the county archives, he said. His voice sounded tired. These papers were supposed to be filed years ago. The brass latch clicked open. Inside sat bundles of letters, contracts, receipts, and legal filings tied together with faded string. Dust rose as Luke lifted the first stack. For the next 2 hours, they read. And little by little, the story they thought they knew began to change. The name appeared again and again. Otis Blackwell, a wealthy land speculator, a man who had owned property throughout the valley years before, a man few people talked about anymore. Evelyn unfolded a letter written in Benjamin Mercer's hand. Luke stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. The letter mentioned altered figures, missing information, pressure to sign documents quickly. Another document revealed something worse. Otis Blackwell had quietly manipulated several transactions connected to Benjamin's loan. The numbers presented to Harold Carter had not matched the actual agreements being arranged behind the scenes. A separate receipt showed payments moving through accounts neither Benjamin nor Harold ever knew existed. The deeper they looked, the clearer it became. Benjamin had been trapped. But Harold had been misled as well. Not innocent. Not entirely. Yet not the mastermind everyone believed. The silence inside the church grew heavier. Finally, Luke lowered one of the papers. For years, he had carried his anger like a stone. Now the ground beneath it was shifting. Judge Reed removed his spectacles. I should have found this long ago. No, Luke said quietly. You couldn't have known. The old judge looked away. Perhaps he was remembering old mistakes of his own. Outside, church bells marked the hour. Life continued. Yet inside that room, decades of assumptions were falling apart. Several weeks later, the truth became public. The records were examined. Witnesses came forward. Old transactions were reviewed. People throughout Dry Creek gathered in the courthouse to hear the findings. No shouting, no spectacle, just facts. One after another. When it was finished, the town understood what had happened. Otis Blackwell had profited while two families blamed each other. Benjamin Mercer had lost far more than land. Harold Carter had allowed unfair terms and made harsh decisions, but the larger deception had never been his alone. For the first time in years, Luke felt something loosen inside him. Not happiness, something quieter. Relief. By early spring, part of the old Mercer property east of the creek was restored to the family name. The snow began melting from the mountains. Grass returned to the valley, and life moved forward. 1 year later, a new house stood on a rise overlooking Dry Creek. It wasn't large, just a sturdy home built from pine and hard work. Luke had built much of it himself. One afternoon, Evelyn was sorting supplies in an old storage shed behind the house. A wooden trunk sat beneath a workbench. She almost ignored it. Almost. Inside, she found a worn leather notebook. No title, no markings, just years of use. Curious, she opened it. The first pages contained short entries, simple observations, nothing dramatic. March 3rd. Helped Mrs. Whitaker patch her roof. Evelyn Carter spent half the afternoon carrying shingles. June 11th. Saw Evelyn teaching young Caleb Parker to read beneath the cottonwood tree. October 19th. She brought soup to the Davis family after their daughter got sick. Page after page continued the same way. Dates, moments, memories, quiet things. The kind of things most people never noticed. Evelyn slowly sat down on an overturned crate. Sunlight filtered through the cracks in the shed wall. Her fingers trembled as she turned another page. The entries stretched back years, long before Luke proposed, long before she ever imagined he might love her. Tears blurred the ink, not because the words were grand, because they weren't. Every line felt honest, real. Near the end, she found the final entry. The handwriting was familiar, steady, certain. She read it twice, then a third time. I came to Dry Creek because of one man. I stayed because of Evelyn Carter. For a long while, she simply sat there, holding the notebook, listening to the wind moving through the grass outside. Eventually, she stood and walked toward the porch. Luke was near the front fence repairing a loose board, the same way he had repaired dozens of fences over the years. Patient, quiet, focused. He glanced up when he saw her. Immediately, he noticed the notebook in her hands. A faint look crossed his face, almost embarrassment. Almost. Evelyn smiled. No words were necessary. The mountains stood blue against the horizon. The valley stretched wide beneath the afternoon sun. No secrets remained. No old debts waited in the shadows. No anger ruled the future. Only a man and a woman who had found their way through years of misunderstanding and grief. Luke rested his hand on the fence post. Evelyn stepped beside him. Together they looked out across the land, and for the first time, it truly felt like home. The evening light stretched across the valley, turning the grass gold and painting long shadows beneath the fence posts. Somewhere in the distance, a horse moved through the pasture, and the wind carried the familiar scent of pine, earth, and wood smoke. Maybe that's what stayed with me most about Luke and Evelyn's story. Not the secrets, not the old mistakes, not even the years of anger that almost shaped both of their futures. What stayed with me was the quiet truth that some people enter our lives carrying wounds we cannot see. And sometimes, the bravest thing a person can do is choose not to pass that pain on to someone else. Imagine standing where Evelyn stood, learning that the person you love once had every reason to hate your family. Imagine standing where Luke stood, holding on to hurt for years, only to discover that love was asking you to become someone better than your anger. Most of us will face a moment like that in one form or another. A moment when we must decide whether the past gets the final word, or whether healing does. If this story touched you, I'd love to know where you're watching from, and what part of Luke and Evelyn's journey stayed with you the most. And if you enjoy stories about second chances, enduring love, quiet courage, and the people who find their way back to one another, I hope you'll join us again. There are still many heartfelt stories waiting beyond the next trail, and I'd be honored to share them with you when you're ready.